the stupidest game show host in the country. Got like a racist buffoon who has no redeemable qualities gets made the president. And your reaction to that was, my views on everything, the nature of the country, pretty much same or unchanged. Then I was like, then we had a different view of the country. Hello and welcome to the Bulwark Podcast. I'm your host, Tim Miller. A little change from Bill Crystal Mondays today. You can get your Crystal fix in written form. His newsletter is out this morning arguing that we're not alarmed enough about what Trump is doing in L.A. But instead, we got a special guest today, author and journalist. His Between the World and Me will be released in paperback next week in observation of the 10th anniversary of its publication. It's Ta-Nehisi Coates. How you doing, man?
I'm good. A little sick, but I'm okay.
All right. What a strange world it is for you to be the stand-in for Bill Crystal. It's a...
Yeah, we're practically indistinguishable.
Who the hell knows how the world will turn? But I want to get into the book stuff and some other bigger picture stuff. But obviously, we had some news over the weekend I want to pick your brain about with the National Guard being deployed to Los Angeles in reaction to the anti-ICE protests. I guess just open-ended first. I want to hear what you make of what we're seeing out there.
Yeah, I think it's tough because I think there are people who probably are trying to be strategic and understand politics who probably don't love this and don't love the visuals that they're seeing. And I think it is certainly true that Trump wants to, bait a confrontation. He certainly did that in 2020 with George Floyd and everything. And so it's pretty clear that, he's trying to create a spectacle, that helps him. And I know that there probably is, again, a tendency or maybe a knee-jerk reaction to dismiss what looks like, the sort of protests, to deal with the very, real thing of having to convince people of your position and not feeling like these visuals are the best. The problem is, I think there are a number of us who have been watching ineffective and probably maybe more importantly than ineffective, feeble resistance and, down to, outright cowardice. And so it's like when people come into your community and, they're snatching folks out of graduations or they're snatching folks when they're going to, report, and follow the letter of the law. When you have a situation in which people are being taken out of this country and thrown into gulags, and folks are laughing about it and laughing about defying judges and, somehow politicians say, well, we shouldn't talk about this. Yeah. You know what I mean? Or some people who, I guess are political pundits say, well, you shouldn't focus on this. The guy who is actually his senator, Van Hollen, who is, represents him, should not advocate for him. People feel the very human need to do something. You can't just come into people's community and inflict violence and expect that there will be no reaction. These are human beings. These are human beings, and so these questions, that necessarily arise, and I understand them, of strategy and tactics, etc. It's very hard to ask people to not be human beings, to not have human reactions.
Yeah, it's on the kind of instigation side of it. It's funny the. Of all places, the Wall Street Journal editorial board this morning wrote this sentence, which is, I think, half insightful about the situation. They wrote, "It's fanciful to think that raiding restaurants to snatch busboys or Home Depots to grab stock clerks won't inspire a backlash." The correct part was the second half of the sentence. They're correct that would inspire a backlash. I think maybe their incorrect part was that there are people around Trump that desire for that not to be the case. I think that's actually the point of what they're doing. But that, like, if even the folks sitting over there at News Corp, can see that this is a natural human reaction. Like, I hear you. It is hard to begrudge that reaction. Like on the other hand, like burning up Waymos and waving Mexican flags, I don't understand what that is achieving either, right? And so it's tough to kind of navigate how to balance those.
I don't know that it's strategic though. You know what I mean? Like I don't know that it is, the fact that some group of people sat back and said, this is going to get us, to this place, in the next, in this period, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. One of the things people don't talk about is enough with the civil rights movement, right? Like they look at the nonviolence and they look at, what appears to be the discipline of it and the suits and the hats and, say, well, why can't we do that? But if you read the history, first of all, what they were doing was tremendously inhuman in the sense of they were training themselves to not defend themselves. This is not, again, a very, very natural human reaction. Somebody hits you, you try to stop them from hitting you. That's a pretty, natural thing. And so they were disciplining themselves to not do that. And then they were constantly dealing with people who, didn't feel like that was how they wanted to live, that somehow that assaulted their dignity, that assaulted, the sanctity, of their body. This was a constant tension, right up to the point where Martin Luther King gets killed, right? And we end up with riots. And is it the case that, you could make, maybe more political progress, if folks dressed in suits and all, waved American flags and carried copies of the Constitution? I mean, possibly, what I mean? I will say that not necessarily. I don't know that would work given where we are right now, but I understand the argument for it. But I just think like we have to build into our politics a tolerance for the idea that people will have human reactions. And then we have to calculate accordingly. You know what I mean? That doesn't mean that, folks don't, try to strategize. But kind of looking at these people and saying, why don't you do X, Y, and Z? Because this always happens. You know what I mean? It always happens. I think it would happen with any community,
And I guess, obviously there's some limits to any parallel, particularly civil rights parallel, but maybe the missing ingredient here is, to your point about kind of the limp resistance coming from the more, whatever you want to call it, establishment, normal sect. Like if that is missing, then like there's a void that is filled. You know what I mean? Like you needed, again, this is really reductive, but you needed Malcolm and Martin, like, you know what I mean? Like you needed both,
and I think what that means is then when you have this kind of limp resistance, it's like the established channels completely lose legitimacy. Yeah. So what am I left with? What am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to just let these people just come in here and do this to my community and not do anything? And I don't think that's a position anybody would want to be in.
What is your sense of alarm, just as far as and I think it seems like things had died down a little bit overnight, but just how quick to the trigger these guys were in the Trump administration with a National Guard deployment. That they put out a press release, 500 Marines from the 2nd Battalion in 29 Palms, California are prepared to deploy. I mean, it does feel like they want to do that.
Oh, they definitely do. Yeah, I mean, I wasn't surprised. Again, if you go back and look at 2020, maybe they were a little slower in 2020, because they had this visual of George Floyd to contend with. But I mean, they were sending people with masks in and with the badges covered up, and this was not ICE. This was not, a matter of, people who weren't citizens. This was, deployed in general against, citizens. And so I'm not surprised by that. They want to portray an image of, this country kind of being at war. Yeah. And Trump is the defender of order. While he loots the country, by the way.
Yeah. I mean, to me, the difference between 2020 is it's obviously not Trump, because his impulse is the same. But it's like, instead of having Mark Esper or whatever in charge of the military, some guy who's not perfect, has got his own flaws, but doesn't want to be, doesn't want his kids to see him as the guy in the history book that sent the military in after, Black Lives Matter protesters in the streets. He's got a weekend talk show host running the military now. Yeah. Right. And so to me, I think that is what makes, that's what makes my concern level higher now than about the potential for state violence than maybe looking back. I don't know if you feel the same
I think
way.
you're right. I totally agree. I thought this when Trump won, though. I mean, it's just like anything could
Inevitable.
happen. Yeah, anything could happen.
One more thing on the Trump or on this part of it. So this is happening now in LA with the specter of we're coming up this weekend. We've got our tank or birthday parade. The birthday boy gets a tank parade through the city in DC. So you spent some time there. I went to Howard. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that visual, the inverse visual, I guess, from the Waymos on fire.
It's bad. It's bad. I do think it's one. I do think it's one of these things that we have to reckon with, which is someday Trump will not be president. But
Are you sure?
I think, I am sure that. I'm not sure that how that's going to happen. Okay. But at some point it will. You know what I mean?
Don't know. The AI is happening really fast. Is it possible they could put they could put Futurama? Right. They could put his brain in a thing like Richard Nixon and make him permanent president.
Yeah, maybe so. But barring some grand AI innovation, I think what is happening is there's significant damage being done to expectations, norms, legitimacy, etc. I actually think that damage started when people began to believe that somehow, when we as a country began to believe our own hype, which is to say, if we say the Senate is the greatest deliberative body in the world, then it must be, and we don't have to do anything, to kind of make that true, make that the case, when folks really began to believe that this wasn't a country, run by fallible human beings, that there were ghosts in the machines that, could guide it, and thus the institutions did not have to be protected, it didn't have to be an amount of caretaking, done there, that really left it vulnerable. And what is happening now, is, the next guy, whoever that is, after Trump, can say, I want a military parade too. I can loot the country too. I can have my own crypto coins and crypto business too, because that's what it is now, and so I think as frightening as, Trump is, and as frightening as he is right now, I mean, I think he probably will go down certainly it's the case so far, as the most impactful president of my lifetime, and that is scary.
Yeah. It's an interesting question, right? Like this, how much of this is irreparable? I think that's another thing that kind of goes back to stuff that you've written about in the past. I mean, we've had dark times that then, things got a little better and then backslid, and, we could go through all the historical examples of that. But, there's certain things that, something changes, the country makes a choice, they go down a path, and the other path is then becomes closed, right? There's certain things that are not fixable. Trump won't always be president. Maybe the next president could come in and put in some reforms to prevent future presidents from having crypto grifts like we did after Watergate or whatever. But
Tim, how does that happen though? How does that how do those reforms happen given what the Senate is, given what the political parties are? How does that even happen?
Yeah, I guess you asked. I'm going to answer the question with a question, which is, I don't what do you think? I don't know. It's hard. I guess that was the point of me bringing it up, is that it's hard to see along some of these vectors things getting better, at least in the short to medium term, because of putting him back in again, right? I do think it was potentially reparable, at least some of the damage from the first term, but now, it is hard to kind of envision a way, back to a politics that looks more like what it was like before him. But then I guess there's a question of do you want that? Right? Maybe something else emerges out of it. I don't know.
Yeah, I would hope something else emerges out, because I don't think I don't think Trump just magically appears.
Right.
I think there were currents, and I think there were things that were already happening that made him possible. And so that probably has to be, dealt with to begin with. I also think, and I don't know where you are in this, because I know you're, maybe even at this very moment going through your own political evolution. As all good citizens and thinking people should be, by the way.
Yeah.
You know,
nothing wrong with changing your mind, man. That's what I always say to people. People would never change their mind that I'm much more suspect of. I always said to people, I was like, if the stupidest game show host in the country got like a racist buffoon who has no redeemable qualities gets made the president, and your reaction to that was, my views on everything, the nature of the country, pretty much same or unchanged. Then I was like, then we had a different view of the country. You know what I mean? So anyway,
no. So I just say that to say that I do think people have to have some positive vision of the state. Like that has to happen. Like at some point, people will have to feel like the state itself, the government, not America as an abstract concept. Yeah. But the government is itself good for something. And it would be helpful if that something was not just violence. So for instance, if it was not just the cops or the military, like there has to be some positive articulation of the state. And I think that is important because when you are asking people to go out to vote for something, when you're asking people to go out and support something, or, when you're in a situation like we are right now where something is being taken apart, like I've heard a number of people say, look, most Americans don't care about, what happens to USAID. Like most people don't care about, this. Well, that's our failing that they don't care, right? Like that's not just a fait accompli. The fact of the matter is, there have been certain political decisions to talk about the state in a certain way, to talk about the government in a certain way, to portray it in a certain way that has made it easier, to believe that taking it apart can somehow be a good thing or a positive thing. What I'm trying to say is there are narratives that happen before this, great action happens that we all, deploy. And so I think, if we are trying to get either back to something or, probably in my preference forward to something, there has to be some sort of positive articulation of what you're defending. Because if your position is just, I am just slightly less skeptical of the state than this guy.
Yeah.
I don't think that works,
And I guess this gets to a conundrum that the Democrats have, in particular in the Trump era, which is that at some level, a positive articulation of the state is a defense of the status quo, right? It doesn't have to be a full-throated defense of it, but it has to be a defense of like what is good about America, right? Whether it be the institutions or, liberal democracy or pluralism, right? Like it has to be the rule of law, right? Like, okay, these are things that America has done that is good, but Democrats find themselves being defenders of a status quo that people don't like, and that takes us back to the first thing you mentioned, which is you end up kind of having a limp pushback. So how would you navigate that if somebody called you and said that they want to be the standard bearer of this and they want you to help them find some words for it? Like what would you even say?
So let me just say up front that I'm somewhat in tension with the advice I'm about to give, right? Okay. And this is why I'm not in electoral politics. There is a long history of African-American leaders, both asserting, I can't believe I'm gonna say this, both asserting the greatness of America and like the flaws at the same time. You know what I mean? So when Martin Luther King goes to, the March on White, he says, I'm just, the check has come back. You said X, Y, and Z is true. I think that's great. I think those things you are standing for are great. You're not doing them.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so it doubles as kind of a defense of the country, you know what I mean? Or as a statement, a positive affirmation of the idea of what it should be. And then at the same time, a real articulation, of what is actually happening. If you sense me grimacing at that idea a little bit, it's probably because as I have myself changed over the past, 5 to 10 years, particularly, my politics are probably becoming a little bit more international. And so I am now always just concerned about making sure, this country is just in terms of its treatment of its citizens, but that it really is a just actor on the world stage. And maybe you're getting this from me, but I feel that oftentimes we are not.
Yeah, right. And maybe, I don't know. I mean, maybe there is somewhat of an answer in that to like this, political conundrum that the Democrats have themselves in. Like maybe there is a way to talk about like the flaws and the mistakes and the things that we need to change while like uplifting maybe not the state but the people, the nature of the American people, the nature of the American people and the experiment. Or maybe that's bullshit.
I'm skeptical.
Or maybe that's bullshit.
Because it's like, I think that's how we get here, though. I think that's exactly how we get here. Because, like, I don't want to like personalize this, but the thing I think about all the time, like I think about, I wrote a piece on Barack Obama at the end of his presidency, right? And he's very kind and granted me, a lot of time to interview and talk with him. And I wrote this, so it's not like I'm breaking any news, but the thing I remember him saying most out of that interview, out of, everything he said and all the articulate things he said was, Trump can't win. And he can't win because there just isn't a history in this country of, I guess what he actually said was, normally, with a couple of exceptions, the American people respond to people with a positive vision.
Yeah.
And not a negative vision. And he was, that wasn't a line. You know what I mean? Like he really did at that point in time believe that. He may not now, but he really did believe that. And I think about that a lot because I think it is a manifestation of like how some of this conversation about the experiment and about the people deludes us, allows us to ignore the fact that we are still human beings and we are still subject to, all of, the flaws and all of the impulses and all of the darkness and all of the things that are in the soul of human beings. And so it is certainly possible to, to build, as Trump has proven, a political movement off of the darkest parts of us, and that is unfortunate, you know what I mean? But I think if we can face that, like my worry is that we feel that there is something in us, in our bones that makes us invulnerable to this sort of rhetoric. And I think we would, do well to dispense with that.
Well, let's talk about that. It's a little bit kind of what I want to get into in the book too in a minute, but like, what does facing that look like? It's interesting you say that about President Obama, because I agree with you. I think that he believed that. Like, I think that he believed that of all the flaws of the American people, like that, that the American spirit was stronger and that there was something about the country's, aspirations that made them reject like the most dark elements of Trumpism. And there are a lot of us, that woke up a couple months ago and we're like, fuck. Like we went from like we had this realization, right? That was like, we went from thinking we made a mistake. Hillary actually got more votes. We weren't prepared. We didn't do the right things. We didn't make the right arguments. We didn't have the right standard bearer. And like, it was excusable and it's fixable, to thinking, oh no, like
right. We actually lost this time.
Yeah, this is bad. Like the country is bad, maybe like at its core. And so so when you say, okay, to make things better, you have to face that. Like, what does that look like? Because there's a part of you that says, well, maybe I should just relent into despair then and just say, fuck this, and kind of become like them, right? I don't know, become a mirror image of them is maybe the right. I think that's a rational reaction. So I don't know. How do you process that challenge? Because you've been processing it long before. I reread the book last night. You were talking about all this stuff 10 years ago.
I mean, but that's the political tradition, right? Like, I mean, like, I just, I say this all the time, but African Americans in this country as a community have been enslaved in this country longer than they have been free. So what that means is that, or, on these shores, I guess, if you predate
Sure.
for the country organized. But what that means is that to the extent that, people cared about human rights or anything like that, like the idea that people's children shouldn't be sold off because of the color of their skin, that people shouldn't be worked to death because of the color of their skin, that women should not be subject to industrialized rape and sexual assault. I mean, for most of it, we were just kind of like, I don't love it, but you know what I mean? Like, many, obviously, so many of our founding fathers was, like they owed their existence to that. And it took a war that killed 20% of the military age white male population in the South to get rid of it. I mean, that's a high price.
Yeah.
It's a really, really high price. And so what that means is not that, America is, as a state or as a country is somehow worse than all other countries or states in the world. What it means is that we have just as much capacity for looking away from evil as everybody else. And yet, if you look at the political tradition that comes out of that, it's not really a despairing tradition. You know what I mean? These are people who are, kind of facing the worst of it, in terms of, America. And I think for, complicated reasons, sometimes good, sometimes bad. The answer rarely is this thing is totally and completely corrupt. We need to abandon it. Sometimes that's the answer. And some of that, I very much identify with. But certainly the mainstream position of the politics is not that. You know what I mean? And so I think on one level, the Black tradition really does grapple with, the dark heart of humanity that is here and is very much present, in America and has always been, present, while at the same time trying to, advance it. And again, I don't think that's because there's anything bone deep about Black people in this country. It's just the nature of our experience here and what we've had to. Despair isn't really an option. You know what I mean? Because it's like, despair is like, oh, you know what I mean? I just allow, it's like, they sold my son, from Virginia down to Mississippi. And so am I going to completely abandon all efforts to find him? That's what despair is. Yeah. So I can't betray him by doing that, right? Like we have people at stake. You know what I mean? It's very intimate with us. And so to despair is to like, abandon people, which I think is a bit much for us.
Yeah. And this is the thing that kind of pisses me off sometimes when thinking about the conversation around Trump voters, thinking about how to process all this is like, there's a lot of this excuse making, right? It's like, there's economic pain, there's resentment. Like the factory towns got hollowed out, and the Appalachia, there was fentanyl, and I got there's some truth to all that, but like you hear all that and you think, well, okay, but Black folks went through way worse than all this, in the last generations. I know one of the things I was reading from you recently, I forget which article it was in, was where you were like, if anybody should be angered about the devastation wreaked by the financial sector and a government that declined to prosecute the perpetrators, it's the African Americans. The housing crisis was one of the primary drivers in the past 20 years of the wealth gap, right? And you didn't see this radicalization, right? Like at a community level, right? Individual level, but like at a community level, you didn't see this. Okay, what we really need to do is put in charge our most comically evil, standard bearer and punish the perpetrators.
Right.
But that's it has been what you've seen from, a lot of folks on the MAGA side. And I just don't like, okay, so what is the lesson there? Sometimes it takes you to a bad place when you think about the lesson is that they were successful in putting Donald Trump in.
I think it is hard to accept that culture is an extremely important part of politics. That there's not going to be a politics that doesn't have a cultural war component to it. Yeah. There just isn't. I was talking to somebody a couple of months ago, who I, actually was, I think, further to the left, and they were making the point, I think, it was an astute political point that, hey, I won't go out and talk about, say, trans rights or immigrant rights, to this person over here. I will focus on the things that we have in common economically, and try to build the coalition there. It's not that I'm, anti-trans or anti-immigrant, but I'm trying to build a coalition, and coalitions have to be built on the things that are shared. And I said, yeah, that makes sense. But what happens, like, when your opposition starts attacking those people, right? Like that really is, I get it. Hey, you don't want to highlight it and talk about it. I understand that. That's not the, the point of, how you get elected. But when people decide that they want to talk about it, what do you do then? Yeah. And I probably am one that feels that it's immoral to see bullying and to look away from it, and not to mention, as some people are now pitching, jump in on it. You know what I mean? Like I don't, and it's tough, man. Like to accept that a group of people, or that someone would turn over the entire state because somewhere in the country there's a high school track athlete who is transitioning and maybe won first place. Like that would be enough. I mean, that's scary.
Yeah.
Like that's really scary.
I also struggle with the premise of the argument because, like, the economics of the Trump voter is better than most people throughout the world. Like the French haven't turned to a Trump. Like we did better than the European, and so it doesn't work for me as a unifying theory that it's just the economics. Like the cultural part, the cultural battle, like is a much clearer to me, like, rationale for him.
Let me also just advance that a little bit too. I mean, there are people, I think, whose politics I probably share in terms of what they want to see, in terms of what the social safety net should be in this country. But when you look to Europe, where the social safety net is a lot stronger, and you talk to Black people over there, and you talk to Arabs, Arab people over there, they do not feel that the social safety net has been necessarily been an anti-racist endeavor. Right. In other words, it has not expunged, those feelings. You know what I mean? It really hasn't, which is to say that, you can deal with all of that economic stuff in the way that a lot of people suggest, they should be dealt with. And yet,
right.
I mean, listen.
Yeah, not a ton of liberalization in Qatar. In the UAE,
right.
There's like a lot of economic prosperity that's passed
true.
along to everybody.
That is exactly right. That is exactly right. I mean, in our own country, post-war period, I mean, you have this boom, and in terms of, like we see that as the golden age. I don't think anybody would describe, post-war America, as a particularly tolerant, not racist, place.
Right, time for some life talk. Life insurance talk, that is. You probably have it, but do you know how much you're paying for it, or how much is being covered? Odds are you're paying too much for too little. And did you know if you receive life insurance through your job and you're unexpectedly laid off, you could suddenly be covered for nothing? It's scary to think about, but it's simple to get it right, thanks to SelectQuote, where I'm headed to sort out my life insurance policy. Look, we got a lot of uncertainty out there in the world. Producer Jason was gone for a week and came back, and LA is on fire, and Elon Musk and Donald Trump have divorced. You just never know what's going to happen in this world. So it's important to get some certainty where you can. And for over 40 years, SelectQuote has been one of the most trusted brokers in insurance, helping more than 2 million Americans secure over $7 billion in coverage. Their mission is simple: to find you the right insurance policy for your unique needs. Unlike other one-size-fits-all life insurance companies, SelectQuote's licensed agents work for you in as little as 15 minutes. They'll compare policies from top-rated carriers to find you the best fit for your health and your budget, and they work for you for free. Head to SelectQuote.com, and a licensed insurance agent will call you right away with the right policy for your life and your budget. Life insurance is never cheaper than it is today. SelectQuote, they shop, you save. Get the right life insurance for you for less and save more than 50% at SelectQuote.com/Bulwark. Save more than 50% on term life insurance at SelectQuote.com/Bulwark today to get started. That's SelectQuote.com/Bulwark. I want to get into a couple more of the elements from your book we've been touched on, but first there's this other book out there that has people kind of aflame, Abundance. I'm sure you've been hearing the chatter about this. Ezra wrote this yesterday about the theory of power, and I was like, man, I have to get Ta-Nehisi's reaction to this, because I don't really know where you'll take it. But he wrote this because I guess to set this up, some on the left have been criticizing him, saying that the book does not have a clear view of power, and that the right way for the left to gain power is to create enemies, particularly in the billionaires and the corporate leaders. And this was his pushback to that. My view of power is more classically liberal. In his book, Liberalism, The Life of an Idea, Edmund Fawcett describes it neatly. Human power was implacable. It could never be relied on to behave well. Whether political, economic, or social, Superior power of some people over others tended inevitably to arbitrariness and domination unless resisted and checked. To take this view means power will be ill-used by your friends as well as your enemies, by your opponents as well as by your neighbors. From this perspective, there are no safe reservoirs of power. Corporations sometimes serve the national interest, sometimes betray it. The same is true of governments, unions, churches, etc. What do you think? What do you make of that?
I mean, it seems right to me. I mean, that quote.
There's some people that are very mad about that online.
No,
some that are like, no, that's not accurate, actually. And it's a false equivalence between, these groups.
I haven't read the column, so maybe it's like something around the column.
Yeah, I'm throwing it on you.
That I'm missing. You know what I mean? Let me just say that. But while I followed the debate, I haven't had the chance to read Ezra's book. You know. And so I'm still a little confused, in terms of what the lines of the debate actually are, to be frank with you.
Here's why I asked you about it. I sorry to put you on the spot. I asked you about it because I saw the Ezra tweet when I was reading your an Atlantic article you wrote about Tony Jute. And there was a bit in that where you were talking about power. Wow, and you were writing about how about how there's this arc of, moral arc of history that was bending towards justice, the Obama view, and Jute was basically saying, no, people do not pay the price for their, ills, and that the only way to make things better is to gain power. And so, anyway, that's why I was curious, kind of whether you had thought through that.
Yeah,
kind of question about the right way, the right way to view gaining power.
Yeah, I love that quote. That's actually from his book Post-War, and one of the things that book is very, very clear-eyed about is the means by which, what we call, Europe today was, established. Our rosy-eyed view of how the West greeted the survivors of the Holocaust and dealt with the implications of the Holocaust and the implications of World War II. And what he's talking about at that point is, actually ethnic cleansing, and how, like, there's some, journalists who, believing in, the divine justice of the world, believes that people will pay, for that. And Tony is just like, no, there's no evidence that anybody ever paid. Sometimes the bad guys just get away with it. You know what I mean? And that, I read that. So I think Between the World and Me was published in 15, because we're 10 years. So it would have been published in 15. But really, Between the World and Me comes out a case for reparations. Yeah. And so I read that in 13, before I went into the case for reparations, actually. And one of the things that conditioned me for was like just a view of the world and a view of history, because I do think, certainly within the African-American tradition, and I think this is because of, perhaps our relationship with Christianity and the force with which, Christianity has, exerted itself in our politics and among, our greatest leaders, in fact. That there is some sort of, at the end of the day, this will work out. The arc of, the arc of the universe is long, but bends towards justice. And I guess Tony was probably one of the first people I read that was like, no, the arc is bent. People have to bend it. Yeah, it does not bend. There's no gravity. There's no anything. And in fact, to the contrary, if anything, the inertia is on the side of evil, not good, and so that was just a revelatory moment, and I probably all of my writing, proceeds from that,
Yeah. Let's take it to the Between the World and Me then. You mentioned earlier that I think you said something like in the 5-10 years since your views on it have evolved in some ways. And how so? I guess would be my question.
Well, I mean, a big one is, and I've talked about this quite a bit, it's probably case for reparations. So I should explain the relationship between those two things. Okay. I was at the Atlantic for 10 years, and somewhere around 2012, 2013, the grades, that job was so cool, man. And the coolest thing was like, I was blogging, and I would write like maybe twice a year or once a year, like these big pieces for the magazine. Yeah. And what that meant was I just had so much time to read. I just had just tons of time to just read and absorb. And because of what the blogosphere was then, I would often write about what I was reading. And then I would have this feedback, with the people that were commenting, and they would say, well, you should read this, you should check out that. And I would go check out that. And so I was like in this, I think this hyper period of growth. And I don't know that I knew it then, but much of my political journey at that point was really just to answer the question of why was it that in every single socioeconomic indicator you looked at, Black people were typically, somewhere at the bottom. And I only say, somewhere, to include Indigenous Americans in that, calculus.
Yeah.
Why was that so consistent? And at the time, and you still hear this sometimes, but less so now. There was a huge argument for culture, et cetera, which never passed my smell test.
Yeah. Right. Baggy jeans.
Like yes. Baggy jeans. Pull up your pants, right?
Yeah, pull up your pants, and that'll solve it.
It's enough. You should pull up your pants, but I don't think that's why.
I don't know. I was at World Pride this past weekend. A lot of people seem to be doing well economically and had their pants down. So
right, it was fine. It was fine, as it turns out. But I feel like I started to get answers to that question, and that really led me to Case for Reparations. And the real breakthrough for me was that I was able to articulate it for my editors in such a way that they understood it, and not just understood it, got excited about it and backed it and did everything. And so that was a remarkable, thing for me. And Between the World and Me came out of a need to express emotionally, which was really an empirical case in Case for Reparations. And so those two things happened. And two really big things came out of that. The first was that, I don't even feel comfortable articulating this, but a level of fame accrued to me that I did not expect. It was not George Clooney fame, but it was make Ta-Nehisi uncomfortable fame. Yeah. Which maybe doesn't take much.
People looking at you at the airport, when you're just trying to read a book.
Yeah, like yesterday. I just got off a plane from Denver yesterday. And you would think I'd be happy about this. I guess I should be, but the stewardess is like, man, I knew I recognized you, and then I saw your name, and I love seeing you on Democracy Now!, and I love your books. Thank you, da-da-da-da-da. And while I appreciate her, I really, really do, there's a part of me that just kind of wants to put on sunglasses and go like this, right? And go on. Not that she did anything wrong, but I'm saying that I was uncomfortable with the amount of that. And what it did was it meant that a number of critiques, began to come in, which is fair and what should happen. And part of that is linked to, the second thing, which is that one of those critiques was the Case for Reparations and, how I wrote about Israeli reparations in that. Yeah. And it was said to me in a way that forced me to take it seriously. And I spent some time taking it seriously. And, my book that just came out, the message that came out of that, in some ways is an attempt to, reconcile myself to Palestinians, to the impact of my work, on that community, to Israel, to Zionism. But I have to tell you, it is also one of those moments where I guess I realized, even like how naive I was about the country I lived in. Yeah. And what it had its fingerprints on and what we did. And so that goes beyond Israel. Like then you start looking at everything. Kim Burns has this documentary, which he put out years ago, on the Vietnam War, but I just happened to watch it, recently. And you see things, it's a great documentary, but you see things like that and you say, well, okay, if this was true of us in this moment, what is our basic nature then? Like what else have we done? What else have I missed? What else am I not seeing? And so that's kind of the path I've been on.
I wonder, I don't know where you're going to take that. And I think that the personal reflection is important. Obviously, it's something I've been going through. I'm curious about the external though. Like this whole sort of world like evolves, not out of your book alone per se, but kind of out of a lot of things that are happening around that time, particularly kind of with Black Lives Matter and racial justice. And, when I was rereading the book last night, one thing that struck me is like a couple of times you write critically about like accepting the invention of racecraft in the book. And like you write about this sort of, and there's this tension, right, between making racial identity and like the racial prioritization, like a prime focus versus like rejecting the false construct a bit. And I, again, it was 10 years ago, so I didn't really rereading it now. That struck me because like that, a lot of the folks, in the ensuing decade have leaned in way more to like the kind of racial hierarchy argument side of this, which obviously is there in your work as well. And so I don't know. I'm wondering, did you watch all of that with any, did it evolve your view at all? Or did you think that was cool or I don't know. Like, what did you make of kind of all of the conversation that around that in the ensuing decade?
So that's a great question. And I'll say two things. The first thing is there's a very subtle shift that's being made. And it's present in Between the World and Me. And I really had to do it when I was doing Case for Reparations, because the argument in Case for Reparations is not that Black people should get reparations. It is that victims of enslavement, Jim Crow, should get reparations. There's a very subtle difference there.
Yeah.
The point is not the color of your skin. The point is, I can prove that somebody injured you.
Yeah, right.
And you should be paid for that. Just like if, you're walking down the street and the cops jump on you and beat the hell out of you and you sue the city. The city should, repair you.
Yep.
It is connected deeply to the injury, not to, your skin color. And it's a subtle thing, you know what I mean? And so what you're talking about, that is present, in Between the World and Me also. And it's present whenever I think the line in Between the World and Me is race is the child of racism, not the father. In other words, it's the racism that's real. It's a thing. Somebody wants to do something to you. They call you the thing, and then you become the thing in their eyes. Now you have a decision about whether you accept that or not. You know what I'm saying? And so it was always important to me not to accept it. I think the problem comes in the second part. So that's a very nuanced thing that I have to go through and complicated to go through. I think during that same period, some of us decided that social media was an effective place to convey nuanced ideas. I think that was a mistake.
Okay.
I actually think that was the mistake.
In what way?
When I write, I am ridiculously careful. I don't just throw things out. I don't just lob things, because I recognize that many of the things that I am saying are things that people are not really going to want to hear. Even people who are sympathetic to me, like there's a part of them that's like, really, Ta-Nehisi, you're going to make me, question this again. And so it's really, really important that I be as thorough as I possibly can. I be as nuanced as I possibly can. And I be as direct and articulate as I possibly can. There's a phrase in that book, The People Who Think Themselves White, that I actually adopted from James Baldwin, that I repeat over and over again. And I'm not being sarcastic when I say that. I am saying that this is an invention.
Yeah.
That we really aren't different. Like, there really is no bone. There's nothing bone deep genetic. There's nothing. There's nothing. You know what I mean? There is a fiction and a narrative and things that have come out of that have made us different, but it's not a real thing. It took forever for me to figure out how to say that in a way that, I felt true to me. You know what I mean? Like, it took multiple drafts and going and looking over sentences again and again. And somebody who is trying to take that level of care, because I believe that's the level of care that we have to take, if we want people to take our ideas seriously, that person probably should not have the ability to immediately try to articulate that, press a button, and send it out to 1 million people. Like, those two things are in tension with each other. I would argue they're actually contrary to each other.
Yeah.
And so I know that there are, I'll just speak for me. It takes so much work and so much effort to say the thing in a way that is true to what I actually feel and I'm seeing. And I am not capable of doing that in a tweet, Instagram, Blue Sky, whatever. It's just not, the medium is not suited for that. And so what happens is then there are either people who fair-mindedly, don't get the nuance of what you're saying. And so that becomes a problem. And there are other people who are completely unfair, and are not legitimate. And then they use this butchered version of you, and that becomes who you are. I think when you're coming with narratives and ideas and themes and theories that are outside of what people are used to and what the mainstream is, you got to be patient. You got to be patient with yourself, and you got to be patient with them. That doesn't mean that you got to be less radical or not aggressive or not say what you think, but you need to make damn sure that you're saying what you think in the best way you possibly can.
It's interesting to put social media on that, because there clearly has been a backlash. I don't like what you ascribe it to, and like what, how much of it was already there versus how much is backlash, right? But at some level, the Trump movement and other, this sort of rise of like more explicitly racist young folks like the Groypers and stuff like this, that like, it's not as if those people did not exist in 1996. They just weren't talking about it in quite as an upfront way, right? So there's some backlash that, and so to point at social media as the, I guess is that what you're saying, that you think that just the nature of the discourse, the social media was the driver of that? Do you think, or that was there going to be a necessary backlash no matter what?
There's going to be a backlash. There's never been a moment. Look, when Obama got president, we should have known. I mean, look, like there've never been moments of racial progress in this country where there was no backlash. So that was going to happen. I guess the thing I'm more referring to is probably some of the writers and maybe even activists who are of accord with me, and in terms of my politics, in terms of where I would like to see the world, who I think maybe articulated themselves too much over social media. Like it became their main way. And actually what they were saying was quite complicated and important and significant, but I don't know that a tweet is the best way to do it.
Yeah. So I guess one more thought about that, kind of evolution over the last 10 years, because I look at it and I want you to go ahead and tell me that this is moderate Tim being misguided about the nature of these things. Please feel free to say that. But I look back at the 10 years, and my daughter's black. I have an adopted daughter, and like one of the coolest things about this.
Wait, how old is she, Tim? How old is she?
She's 7. She's 7.
Okay. Congratulations.
So in this moment, yeah,
you've made it 7 years.
Yeah, dude, she's amazing, and we have made it 7 years. And here's the cool thing about it that she grew up in this moment is that my parents, and my husband's parents, who are from the suburbs and from rural America, respectively, and have like a combined 8 black people in the counties where they lived, right? Growing up, like they now, I think, in a large part to the change that we've seen over the last 10 years, can go buy her kids' books that have little black girls as the main character, and dolls, and like it's easy for them, right? Like rather than having to go out and do it, and they kind of get why it's important in a way that they I don't think maybe would have 20 years ago, right? Like so, there's been progress in this kind of area of recognition and platforming or whatever, identity, that has been positive, and then there's been this other element that's like, well, we're going to have at schools now, we're going to re-separate people and have groups of black kids and white kids in different classes, or we're going to have these things where we rank, the intersectionality and the different levels of oppression, if you're this and that group combined versus that and that group combined. And and to me, it kind of like feels like there was some really positive elements, and then that there were some elements that like lended itself to a more potent backlash. And I don't know if you look at that at the period and feel that at all, or think I'm totally off base about it.
No, I don't think you're totally off base. I think all movements have their excesses, and I think all movements have their fools who are part of those movements, and sometimes those fools, have power, and sometimes those excessive people have power, and they do things that are not smart, and are not in service of the ideals that they claim to be serving. I think that the difference is, so I'm of two minds about this. On the one hand, I feel like, again, like what I was saying before, is that when you are the person that's seeking to revolutionize something, when you are telling a group of people, you want to go in front of a group of people and say, everything you have, all of your material progress in the world and all your mother's material progress, grandmother, all generations, is rooted in the destruction of somebody else's stuff and the theft of that. You have to understand that's going to be hard for people to take.
Yeah.
I say, yeah, that's true. You know what I mean? And so what that means is, I really, have to stress this. It doesn't mean that you don't say it, though.
Right.
But you just have to remember how difficult that would be for you to hear. Right. You know what I mean? And then you have to, say it in the most truthful way you can. You know what I mean? And weirdly enough, I believe this, even though I write hard and write aggressive, you actually have to say it in the most compassionate way you can say it too. Now, compassion to me means something different probably than it does to a lot of other people. For some people, compassion means you talk soft to people and you rub their back. And for me, it means that you address them like adults. You address them respectfully, but you're very direct, with them about what is what. And I think all political movements don't exist under that burden, though. Certainly MAGA doesn't. You know what I mean? Like they can say excesses are the point for them. You know what I mean? Like going over that's the whole point. I mean, to do that. Yet for us, and for people, who, really seek this kind of, bone deep change in the country, that's just not a luxury we have. Yeah. That's not a luxury that we have had. And so are there people out there, who said and did certain things, and articulated themselves in certain ways? And if there's a level of vagary that's coming into my language right now, it's because I was never able to measure like what was what and how much, was, what portion of this was actually true. Yeah. In other words, what portion of this was real and what portion of it was being ginned up. Yeah. I'm not saying no portion of it was real, but it was always, because I'll be honest, like a lot of the people who I was hearing that from were not people who I would say,
you have a lot of respect for their point of view.
Yes. I would not consider them, you know what I mean? Yeah. Now, some things I did, I was like, this is clearly some dumb shit. Like, you know what I mean? Yeah. And I would, have no problem with that. But no, I don't think you're wrong, man. I don't think that is incorrect. I think there were people that did not want 2020. I mean, here's an example that I think about. Maybe I can make this a little bit more tangible, right? Okay. Folks got really upset about defund the police, right? Yeah. Like that became a political flashpoint. Like it became a thing that people said, this person wants to defund the police. How many actual people running for office in Congress and Senate would have said, I want to defund the police? I don't think many said it. Yeah. You know what I mean? It was an activist cry.
Some mayors and prosecutors.
Some mayors and prosecutors. Did they use that language? I mean, and you can tell me they did. I mean, I'm just curious. Did they say, I'm running on defunding the police?
I guess I'd have to go back to the archives. I mean, like there were some functionally, that they were with that crowd, I guess.
With that crowd. See, that's what I mean, though, right? Like I could be with that crowd. You know what I mean? Like, oh yeah, I sympathize with what you're saying, but maybe I would say it differently. You know what I mean? Like, but see, actually, even I'm not, trying to go squishy on this. In fact, I think like what you're saying makes the point, right? Like you have to worry about what crowd you're with. Yeah. But your opposition really doesn't. Yeah. You know what I mean? They can walk around with open racists. Who cares? True. You know what I mean? Like it really doesn't matter. You know what I mean? And so that's like there's a weight you labor under to be on point, correct, you know what I mean, at all times. I feel like as a writer, this serves me because it actually forces me to reinterrogate everything I write. It forces me out of certain mediums. Again, there's certain places I just don't go to talk and I just don't because they don't serve that. And so it really concentrates me. But I do understand that, I don't know. I guess I go back to where we started at the beginning here. People are human. Yeah. People are human, and sometimes they're unwise in how they, articulate things and think about things and say things. And they say things that, maybe get them an applause and not necessarily are about the work that they claim to be.
Two other little items from the book. And when I read it last night, I was like, I thought about it differently than I would have in 2015. Dr. Mabel Jones, my favorite character. God love her, lost her son, LSU grad. I should shout that out. She's unbelievable. You said when you're talking to her, compared America to Rome. Glory days long ago past, and those were sullied, and we can't get the message. We don't understand that we're embracing our deaths. This was you to your son later in the book. You wrote, I do not believe that we can stop them, being the kind of American power structure, because they just will ultimately stop themselves. Both of those things seem a lot more acute than maybe they did in 2015. Jesus.
That was harsh.
Was that not in your spirit of compassionate writing?
No, it wasn't my spirit of compassionate writing. Because I think like your compassion begins with honesty. Yeah. And I think actually people can feel that. I think people can feel when you're trying to hurt them, and when you're trying to be straight with them. Yeah. I mean, again, I think what echoed in the back of that writing was, I said earlier that like I started with Case for Reparations. I had done at that point, I did so much research for that work that what became clear was that the standard, sort of liberal articulation of this of America as a fundamentally good country, fundamentally in its bones good, that just made some mistakes, some significant ones, but some mistakes, was false. Those things that are dismissed as mistakes are actually core to what the country is. And if you take them out, you actually don't have a country. And so that can't help but reformulate, how you feel. And so that I can be completely, maybe a little clearer about what I mean when I say that. I think, when I was writing Case for Reparations, I was writing to a reader who probably believed that slavery was a thing that happened in this country alongside everything else. In other words, if slavery didn't happen, you could still have an America. And what became clear is fundamentally that is not true. Like fundamentally, you know what I mean? Like you look at your institutions that date back from their period. It was tough in 1850 to assemble a large amount of money and not have, your fingerprints somewhere on slavery. It was that big of a thing. You know what I mean? And then that followed through into, and this was the heart of the essay, the GI Bill and, all of the reforms then, which were only possible by excluding African Americans. They wouldn't have passed. You just wouldn't have had them.
Right.
And so when you start accepting that about the country, you say, oh, this is who, if you just think about it as a person, and now you're getting an accurate biography of who that person is. And you say, oh, so where is that person probably going in 10 years? And so like for that book, it fundamentally caused me to fundamentally reassess what was possible, what was likely possible. You know what I mean? In terms of what the country could do. That was before Trump too. I wrote that before.
Yeah, right. That's what I'm saying. It's so stark now, right? This, like the element of stopping themselves. It probably felt a little overwrought, honestly, in 2015.
That's what everybody told me.
You know what I mean?
That's what everybody told me. That was the critique of it. They were like, this dude is hopeless. He's overdoing it. He's despair. Come on,
to me,
man.
this feels kind of
really
like modest now. It's this is like a median Bulwark article.
No, man. That was people were like, this dude's gone way too far. What is wrong with him?
All right, real quick, two things real quick. Our culture editor, Sonny Bunch, demanded that I ask you if the Black Superman movie is dead. I know nothing about this world. I guess you have a whole other life where you do comic books and movies and stuff, and this is not my world. I don't care about what happens in magical creatures, but other people do. So I have to ask.
Oh, you should care.
Yeah.
So I guess that the answer I can give is that it's still in development. Other people have said that, so with more power than me. So I don't think I'm going beyond what's been publicly said.
I don't even know what the weight of that question is, to be honest. Literally, I was like, I asked some other folks. I was like, is there anything I should ask him? So he's like, you have to ask him about the Black Superman movie. So anyway, I'm for a Black Superman. I don't know. We saw a lot of backlash to that lesbian kiss in Buzz Lightyear, though, and the Black Little Mermaid. So you never know what the ramifications of that might be. All right, last one then. So the book is framed, right, as to your son, right, Samori? It's written to him. Was it advice to your son, would you say, or more of a explanation for your son of your perspective? You're rereading it. You're like, obviously your backstory like could not be more different than mine, and your experience could not be more different than mine. So I found myself throughout thinking about it as a father, as being like, there's just a lot of like history and life experience that I just do not bring to this job that you did, right? And so I guess my question for you is if you have any advice for me or for my child.
No, you know what I think? I think you're both right and you're wrong. You're right in the point of, obviously just on its face, our backgrounds are very different. Having said that, I do believe that anybody who's had to live a significant portion of their life or their entire life outside of what the dominant culture and politics articulates itself as the ideal, as the archetype, probably has some level of insight into that culture that people who have not don't. You know? And so that was all Between the World and Me was, right? Like, it was like, okay, there's this umbrella of humanity and human rights. I am from a group of people that, for their history, have in general been outside of that. What are my insights on it? You know what I mean? And so I suspect.
Well, you can give me advice without. You don't have to attack me.
No, I'm not.
No, I know you're not. I don't. You don't have to be like, yeah, bro, you're right. You don't know anything. I appreciate that. I know some things. I didn't think I knew nothing. I'm just saying, maybe there's some. There's also some part that's black, that's dark to me, right? That is just not. It was not in my field of vision, and I'm learning about it.
You probably know more than you think.
Okay.
You know what I mean? That's the first thing I would say.
Yeah. All right.
And then, like, you have to remember, like. Most of my insights actually come from taking a much harder, more skeptical look at a story that I already knew. You know what I mean? Or thought I knew. It did not come, for instance, I'm going to go spend some time on, some reservations, and, that would have been a worthwhile endeavor, but
right.
it did not come from that. It actually came from, it was a deeply internal mission that allowed me to externalize. I guess, why am I resisting this question? I don't enjoy the notion of the idea that people write books that other people perceive as insightful. Like, you just wrote the book. Like, you just wrote a book and you were insightful in that moment.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that you're insightful about life. And not only that.
That's fair.
Not only that, there are people who can't write books or don't write books or haven't yet, who have their own stories and their own experiences, and then there's insight that is drawn from that too, and that's equal. You know what I mean? And sometimes more. And just because you wrote the book doesn't mean that you have it more. Like, I began my professional career as a journalist, and part of being a journalist is you sit down and you listen to people, and you make yourself stupid. And oftentimes they have insights into life that just would never occur to you. And so I really do go back to what I was saying. I'm just saying, I think, like, how do you have a conversation with your daughter explaining how different the world is that she's growing up in terms of how it looks at LGBT people and how it looked at you? Like, I imagine that's going to be a little abstract to her.
Yeah.
And yet I imagine there are also lessons and experiences, from having lived through that are probably also important. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
All right, I don't want to assume too much.
No. I'm not. I was the one. It's all good. I hear that, man. It's we're all on a journey and just trying to navigate through it. Mm-hmm. And I feel lucky that I have been able to I go through different kinds of things and experiences that opened my perspective onto different items that maybe I wouldn't have. Right? Had I just been straight, or had I just had like a family that's monoracial, whatever. But like with that comes like challenges and awakenings and all that. So anyway,
I do have one piece of advice.
Yeah. Okay, great. Perfect. We can leave it on that.
Right. If you have the ability and the power at any point to live for some period of time outside the country, and with that, to raise a kid who is not monolingual and maybe already on that, I don't know.
Yeah.
That's a great thing. It's a great thing.
Outside
the best thing I ever did for my kid. Okay. Best thing.
That is good advice. And who knows, I might be thrust out of the country anytime now. So that might make it easy on me. Man, I really appreciate you. This is so fun. It's good to meet you. And let's do it again sometime. All right.
All right. Thanks, brother.
All right. We'll see you soon. All right. Thanks so much to Ta-Nehisi Coates. I really appreciate him coming on the pod. I want to have a bonus segment for you guys. On Friday, we did a live show and fundraiser, Free Andre, in support of Immigrant Defenders, which was the legal effort helping the Venezuelans that have been disappeared to that hellhole in El Salvador. And we had a little bit of fun. If you want to go watch the whole show, which included some pretty raunchy gay jokes, some annoyingly funny material from Sarah, who I think was just just adamant that she was going to outshine me and Lovett, who think we're the jokesters. So if you want to go see all that, the comedy, go to the YouTube page, and you can check it all out there. But for podcast listeners, I wanted to share with you the serious parts of the show. I interviewed Lindsay Kozlowski, who's the lawyer representing Andrei and a handful of other of the Venezuelans. And boy, she's just amazing. And we appreciate her work so much. It was great to finally meet her in person. We've been DMing for a while now. So I've got that segment. And then at the very end of the show, I took off my jokester hat and gave a rant about why this specific case has upset me so much, and why we want to do everything that we can to continue to draw attention to it in the hopes that we can eventually prevent these men from being disappeared for no reason except the cruelty of the folks in this White House. So I hope you enjoy both of those segments as much as possible. If I make you cry, sorry. And we will see you all back here tomorrow with our usual Bill Crystal Monday, but on Tuesday. So stick around, and we'll see you all back here soon.